We are now at part 2 of lecture 17, and in this video, we're going to now look at a first technique for performing density estimation called kernel density estimation. So we previously defined what is a probabilistic model, and we defined an objective for learning probabilistic models. And now I'll define a particular form for probabilistic models, and we will look at how to fit these models to data. And this is going to be the simplest, but still it's a very simple but still an important and useful way of performing density estimation in several interesting settings. So recall that we are in a regime in which we have an unsupervised data set of attributes X, which is sampled IAD from a data distribution, P data. And we want to fit a probabilistic model to this data set, which is going to be a probability distribution over the space of X's with some set of parameters theta. And our goal is to perform density estimation. Density estimation is simply the problem of choosing a P which approximates the data distribution well. And this is a very general learning task. If we can solve density estimation, we can solve also many useful downstream tasks, such as detecting outliers, generating new samples, visualizing and understanding interesting structure within the data distribution. These are all interesting downstream problems. And so in a way, density estimation is the most general problem that we can solve. And many of the algorithms that we're going to introduce in this in our lectures on unsupervised learning, they can be seen as performing density estimation with a particular type of interesting model, and then using this and then using it for solving certain useful problems like clustering. So this is our problem, and we're going to define a first interesting. We're going to define a few very simple but still interesting and useful density estimation approaches based on this context. So perhaps the simplest way in which we could do density estimation. And by the way, I should add that these methods that we're going to define in this video, they're relatively simple. They will not solve all the problems that we have just defined. We're not going to be able to solve them. We're not going to be able to use them to solve every clustering or every dimensionality reduction problem, but they're still useful for certain kinds of problems. And we're going to I'll mention what they are. So let's start with the simplest possible way of estimating a distribution. And this is what's called histogram density estimation. Let's say that we have some points in some d-dimensional space. Perhaps the simplest thing we can do is we can divide this input space into a d-dimensional grid, and then we can count how many points fall within each cell in the grid. And the cells containing more points, they will have higher probability. And then we can normalize the counts, and we can assign a probability to each cell. Let's look at a simple example in one dimension. I'll generate a data set that is coming from the following distribution, which is a mixture of two Gaussians. I have one Gaussian distribution here with mean 0 and variance 1, and here I have another distribution with mean 5 and variance 1. The second one has 70% weight, the first one has 30% weight. And now this is simply a well-defined mixture of Gaussians, and I can generate points from this data set. So here I'm going to use a little bit of NumPy to generate these data points. I will generate 20 of them. Here I simply draw samples from the normal distribution with the parameters that I just showed you. And here I've created this X, and here I print X, and this is the set of points that we have. There's 20 of them. And let's now visualize this. So these points fall on each point is simply a real number. So our X is just a real number. We're in one dimension. And so they fall somewhere along the line, along the real line. And we can take this real line, we can break it into bins. I have defined these bins Here I have bins between 5. I have 10 bins of equal length between -5 and 10. Each of them has width 1.5, and I can now do a histogram of all the points. So here I have my 10 bins. Here the black dots are the points that we have generated, and this is the histogram shape that I have. So you can see here that we have two clusters of points. Here, this was our second Gaussian with mean 5, which 5 is approximately here. It had 70% weight, so about 70% of the points are in this area. And here I have also 30% of the points which are near the second Gaussian, which had mean 0. And if I count how many points are in each bin, so each rectangle here, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, these are all my bins, and I can count how many points fall in each bin, and I can normalize, and this gives me the following histogram. If you're familiar with what a histogram is, this should be very straightforward. And so here it tells me that around 21, 22, 23% of points are here in this bin. So this is an estimate of this density that I can easily obtain in, I can easily visualize this in one dimension, and this same principle can in theory be applied to higher dimensions as well. Now, of course, this is the simplest density estimation algorithm that exists, and it has several shortcomings. The main shortcoming, and we're going to revisit this later, this is actually a fundamental limitation of this family of algorithms, is that the number of grid cells increases exponentially with dimension d. So if I want grids of, if I want to have cells of length 1.5, and I have 10 of them that cover one dimension, well, in 2 dimension it will be 10 by 10, so now we'll have 100 of them. In 3 dimensions I have a cube, so I have to have 1,000 of these cells with again whose dimension is 1.5 along each axis, and in dimension d I will have 10 to the power d such cells. So the number of bins grows exponentially, and this is one important limitation of this approach in high dimensions. And then 2 other limitations that we can address are, one, the histogram is not smooth, and also the shape of the histogram depends on the positions of the bins. And we're going to try to address the last 2 limitations. And just to make it a little bit more concrete, let me visualize what I mean by the shape of the histogram depends on the locations of the histogram bins. So here, imagine if I just took these bins and I shifted each of them by 0.75 to the right. So here this bin is centered at about -3, and now I'll just move it and the bin will be centered at I guess 2.25. So we will just move these bins to the side, or in either direction. And so you can see here this bin starts near -3 and a little bit more, and now this one starts at -2 point something. So the bins have been shifted. The locations, the intervals of the bins have changed, and now I have a completely different shape for the histogram. So here now I have a bin that only has 1 point, another one that has 1 point, 1 point, 1 point. Essentially, these bins are placed such that here they have exactly the same density, and now here there's one bin here which has almost all of the points, and then I have fewer points here. So the problem is that again, because I have shifted the bins slightly to one side, their counts become very different, and the shape, the estimation of this histogram changes. So this is behavior that is not desirable in a good algorithm, And there's a simple way of removing this, of removing this bad behavior, and it involves an idea called kernel density estimation. Kernel density estimation is the second algorithm for doing density estimation that we're going to see, and it's an extension of the histogram binning idea. When we perform histogram binning, we choose B bins, and they have some fixed width delta, and we place them at certain fixed positions. So we define a grid, and then we count how many points fall in each grid. In kernel density estimation, we effectively place a bin at each possible x, where x can be any point in our input space. And then to obtain the probability mass at x, we look at that bin and we count the percentage of points that fall within that bin that's centered at x. So in other words, if I want to know the density at x, I count how many points are within a distance of delta within x, and then I normalize by the total number of points that I have. This is a very high level idea here. Let me just define this a little bit more precisely. This is one particular way of doing kernel density estimation, which is called top hat kernel density estimation. I will tell you in a moment why it's called top hat, but again, the formula is that we define a density P with a parameter of delta, which controls the width of the bin, and the probability of that is assigned at a point x is simply the number of points that are within delta divided by the total number of points. So here n of x is simply the number of points in my data set, such that these points are within so they're within distance delta over 2, which means that the total bin has distance delta has dimension delta. The bin has width delta, and so points, it's centered at x. Therefore, we look at the points that are whose distance is within delta over 2, and these points can be on either side of x, either on the left or on the right. Or this is simply the definition of the intuition that I just gave earlier. And we can easily understand this by looking at a picture. So here I use a bit of NumPy to generate the following histogram. Or it's not a histogram, now it's a kernel density estimate. And you can see here that it is that at each point we count how many, at each possible position on the x-axis, I count how many points are near it, how many data points are near a location in the x on the x-axis. And so if I'm in this area here, well, then I have 2 points that are close to it. And then if I'm a little bit farther out, then I only have 1 point. Then in this area I have more points. And then the I guess the most likely point is this one. It has, or these 2 points, they have, so here my width is 0.75. So it's actually 0.75 times 2, so 1.5. So at this point, within 1.5, well, within 0.75 on each side, we have the maximum number of points. This is a simple illustration of what kernel density estimation does. And it produces a histogram that no longer depends on the location of the bins, because we don't have any locations of the bins anymore, but it still has a problem in that the histogram is not smooth. If I look at this histogram here, we have all these irregularities, shapes. It jumps from one value to another value in a very non-smooth way. So this is another limitation of this technique that we can resolve by introducing another idea that we have seen earlier, which is that of a kernel. And this is what will give the method its name, kernel density estimation. So recall that we define a kernel function as a function k that takes two vectors x and z, and it maps them to a real value score. And this kernel function can be seen as computing a similarity between x and z. Typically, we would define a kernel function such that its value is large when x and z are similar and low when x and z are dissimilar. And we have seen many examples of such functions. In principle, a kernel function can be anything, it can be any function, but in practice, we can construct them by computing dot products in features of high dimension. And even if we don't know what these features are, we have seen that there is a result called Mercer's theorem, which tells us that for many kernels which are positive semi-definite, we have defined this in our earlier video when we talked about kernels. For many types of kernels, we can show that these features do exist, and kernels actually corresponds to mapping in high-dimensional feature spaces. But this latter interpretation of feature spaces is not really important. We're going to use kernels in their first definition, which is a measure of the degree of similarity between x and z. And we're going to use them as follows. Instead of having our probability be simply the count of points in a given region, we will instead, in a way, look at a weighted average of all the points. Or, in other words, we are going to sum over all the points, but each point will have a weight that is given by its similarity to the query point x. And so for xi's which are far away from the query point, this kernel function k will be small, it will maybe equal 0, and for points that are close to xi, this value will be large. And so in that sense, we can think of this formula here as being a weighted average instead of a simple count of points that are within the bin. Instead, we're doing a weighted average of all the points in the data set, and we weight them by their importance. By the way, this notation here, this is called proportional to, so the probability is proportional to this quantity up to a normalization constant. So these kernels because this is a probability, this value can integrate to, this is a density, and these kernels can also, this sum can be multiplied by any constant without changing this property. As long as the density is proportional to this value, we are good, and we can make it normalized to 1 if we take the integral and divide by this value, or we can choose kernels such that this value would hold. And so again, this formula here can be interpreted in two different ways. The first way that I mentioned is that we count how many points are near x, but each point has this weight, which depends on the similarity between the 2 points. Or we can also think of it as placing a mini density function k. So again, k is large when these two are similar, and so in a way this is a form of microdensity function at point xi, and then the final density is going to be their sum. I will explain in a second what I mean by this second interpretation. Let me first tell you about what a kernel might be in this context. When we talked about support vector machines, we saw several different types of kernels, and several of them will be applicable to kernel density estimation as well, but there are others that are also useful that we haven't seen before. Here I'm going to give you a few examples of kernels that are more suitable for density estimation, and here I'm giving a few formulas, but on the next slide, and by the way, these are kernels that are available in the scikit-learn library, and they're just generally used in practical density estimation applications. You have seen the formula, but these are best understood via a figure. So this is just code that draws all these kernels, and essentially these are their shapes. So here these kernels are a function of the distance between the 2 points. So if we have x and z, we compute their norm, and then if their norm is 0, then the Gaussian kernel here gives them the highest value, and then for x and z for which the distance is non-zero, we decrease this to something that's larger. But we don't need to use this Gaussian curve. We can use a linear term, so it decays to 0 linearly and then it stays at 0, or we can have this other form. And the one that we have seen before is the top hat kernel. And when we talked about top hat density estimation, this can be seen as density estimation with this particular choice of kernel. Essentially, if 2 points x and z are within a fixed distance of each other, we count them as 1, and if their distance is greater than this threshold, which is again a tunable parameter, if they're greater, then it's 0. And so by using a top hat kernel in the formula that I gave earlier, we are essentially at each query point, we're simply counting how many dataset points are near the query point. But if and so we disregard everything that's greater than a certain distance from the query point. But if we use something like a Gaussian kernel, then we may still assign weight to points that are farther away from the kernel, but this weight is going to be really small. Let's now look at a simple example of kernel density estimation in the context of our data set of one-dimensional points. Again, we will fit a model of the following form, where each kernel here is Gaussian with a parameter delta, which controls the width of the bell curve. So here, I'm just using the kernel density estimation class in scikit-learn. I feed it a Gaussian kernel with a bandwidth of 0.75, and I fit it to the data. And then from this kernel density estimate, I can get an estimate of the log density, and then I can plot this density here. So the blue line is the estimate of the density that we get from Gaussian kernel density estimation. And now you can see that this is a smooth two-dimensional, a smooth one-dimensional curve with 2 peaks. Each peak corresponds to a Gaussian. So we recover this true structure that's in our data that consisted of 2 Gaussians. There was 1 peak here, there was 1 peak here, and we have successfully recovered this. And furthermore, our our density is fully smooth. It doesn't have these jagged shapes that our earlier example had, and in that sense, this is a good estimate because it has we expect the actual probability to be smooth, and it is indeed. We know that it is smooth because we have defined it, and here this shape matches our smoothness shape. And then these little dashed red curves, these are the kernels at each point. So here I have taken a kernel here at this location on the x-axis, this location on the x-axis, and then this is simply the value of the kernel of the kernel at this location. So I have fixed one of the inputs to the kernel function to be a point on the x-axis that's centered here, and you see in dashed red the value of the kernel as I vary the other parameter. And so if it's different from the center of the kernel, then this kernel becomes smaller and it achieves its highest point when we're bigger. And so it itself has this bell-shaped curve, and the blue curve is proportional to the sum of all of these mini red Gaussians. And so effectively, I obtain the blue curve by placing this small red Gaussian at each of these black dots, and then I sum them and I normalize, and this is how we get this particular blue-shaped estimate. This blue smooth estimate is simply the sum of all of these red curves that are centered at the dots, which is my data set. And so in that sense, you can also think of the blue density as being a sum of these small red microdensities that are each centered at a point. And of course, this is for the Gaussian kernel, but the same intuition would apply if we use the top hat kernel we would see the results that we had in our earlier figure. So in principle, kernel density estimation also works in higher dimension. But as I mentioned earlier, our grid has, the size of this grid increases exponentially. So if I want to have a bandwidth delta in one dimension, if I want to keep the same bandwidth in higher dimensions, my grid size will increase exponentially unless I increase delta. But if delta is fixed, then my number of, if I have B cells in one dimension, then I will have B to the D cells in multiple dimensions. And in order to fill all these cells with data, so for example, if in one dimension each cell had on average, if I had 10 cells and each on average had one data point, now in two dimensions I have 100, in one dimension I had 10 cells, in two dimensions I have 100 cells. Now I need 100 data points such that one cell has 1 point on average. And if I have 1,000 cells, now I need 1,000 data points to keep the same density. And so because of that, kernel density estimation requires significantly more data in higher dimensions. And this limits the applications of this approach in higher dimensions, but it is still in principle doable, and well, it is still used in dimensions of reasonable size, and in lower dimensions, this is an important tool set that you should be. It's an important tool that you should have in your tool set. Also, all of the methods that I defined earlier had this notion of bandwidth delta. It's either the shape of the Gaussian kernel, or it's the width of the top hat kernel, which counts how many points are near our query point X. And this is a hyperparameter that can control the smoothness of the fit. Here, as in many other algorithms that we have seen, we have the question of how do we choose this hyperparameter. And we have several options. One way is to perform the kind of heuristics that we discussed when we were talking about how to choose K for K-means. We can use the elbow method, or we can visualize the results, and we can just choose an estimate that has a reasonable shape that looks good. But also, because this model that we're working with is probabilistic, we can also use a different approach that I will talk about in the next lecture, which involves estimating likelihood on a holdout data set. And since we have an objective that we can use to score the fit of our model, which is the log likelihood, we're going to be able to estimate performance on training and holdout data in a way that's similar to what we did in supervised learning. But I will come back to this later. For now, I just want to mention that there exist these two approaches, and the heuristics that we have seen for K-means, they are also applicable here. Just to give you a better sense of what it means to choose a hyperparameter delta, let me give you an example. Here on the left, I have set the bandwidth to be 3. So the width of the Gaussian is 3. And this just gives me a very smooth curve, but I have lost all the structure that I had. I no longer have, I have lost the structure in the data that showed that I had two components. So here, this is an example of losing the signal that is important. And here on the right, I have a small bandwidth of 0.2, and now I have all these peaks, but I have, at this point, I'm fitting noise because the true distribution is actually much more smooth than this. So here, distribution becomes highly non-smooth, and at this point, we're fitting noise. And so this would be an example of, I would call this overfitting, and on the left, I would call this underfitting. And these are two failures for when we don't choose the right bandwidth. And again, in practice, we can choose the right bandwidth by either via heuristics, or by inspecting these visually, or by using an approach based on likelihood that I will talk about later. So just to summarize, we have defined an algorithm called kernel density estimation. It's an algorithm for unsupervised learning. It solves the density estimation problem, and its model family is non-parametric. As you saw earlier, the probability is a sum over kernels over n data points, and so the number of kernels increases as we increase n. So in that sense, our computational requirements increase as we increase our data set size, which makes the model non-parametric. And then we choose it to, so we don't really fit the model itself, but we can use the log likelihood to choose the bandwidth, which is a hyperparameter of the model, and we can choose this bandwidth using grid search. And the main advantages of kernel density estimation is that it can in principle fit the data distribution arbitrarily well. It is a non-parametric model, so it can fit the data distribution equally arbitrarily well given enough data. But it is computationally expensive to work with a non-parametric method that stores the entire data set, and also the number of data needed to scale these non-parametric algorithms scales exponentially, which is something we call the curse of dimensionality, and I alluded to this earlier. So in the next few lectures and videos, we are going to see some more sophisticated models for density estimation that will be parametric and that will address many of the limitations that are on this slide.